Hello and welcome to Counterculture. I'm Peter Whittle. Now, about 3 weeks ago, we started a campaign called Save Our Statues. We launched a new website called saveourstatues.org.uk. And you might remember that at the time, the statue issue was really at its very height, but it hasn't gone away. In fact, it's bubbling away under the surface all the time, with various councils around England talking about revising all their statues and public memorials. We're very pleased to say that since we started that campaign, so many of you have actually got in touch and wanted to help. We've had hundreds of people coming forward as supporters or joining up as members or wanting somehow to find out how they can actually be involved on the ground. So that's very, very encouraging. Statues continue to be in the news. You might have seen actually last week there was a new one that was unveiled on the 4th plinth in Trafalgar Square. It is called The End. Here's a picture of it. It's like a kind of strange postmodern ice cream. This is right in the middle of London. Somewhat I think the very most complimentary thing you could say about it is that it's somewhat pretentious. At the same time, a few days before that, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, put out a press release giving us more details about his so-called Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm. This is going to look at all of London's historical statues, memorials, street names and murals, and to judge whether they are ones that should still be celebrated or not, whether in fact new ones should be commissioned, or indeed old ones got rid of. These are all very important issues which we're going to be discussing today. We're also going to be looking at the Europe-wide situation. Is this just something affecting Britain or Western Europe, or is this something further afield? Now, with me to discuss this, I've got 5 guests today. I'm pleased. We're first of all joined from the Czech Republic by Richard Bingley, who is General Secretary of the Save Our Statues campaign. We have Thomas Stranack, who was instrumental in saving the Baden-Powell statue down in Poole in Dorset. Emma Webb, who is from the think tank Civitas. Robert Poole, who started the Save Our Statues Twitter campaign, which is going great guns at the moment. And the historian and commentator and our resident guest on the New Culture Forum, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. Thank you very, very much for joining us. I want to start actually on the Europe issue, in fact. We hear a lot about the position in America with statues and memorials being attacked, and also in this country. But you're in the Czech Republic at the moment, Richard. What's the situation like there? Are they looking on it and thinking that this is something weird that's happening in Britain?
Bluntly, yes. The fact over here really is that they had quite small Black Lives Matter protests, but there's no great clamour to remove any sort of historical cultural furniture at all. The big dilemma over in East Europe and Central Europe was obviously about removing communist statues and those related to sort of Russia or Soviet Union. And there was a kind of decision 20 years ago to not remove them. They were going to contextualize them. And indeed, in Budapest, the Freedom Square there, they still have statues of Russian generals. So over here, there's kind of a lot more memorial around Russian generals who helped to fight the cause against Nazism.
So when you say...
we did have a statue over here to Winston Churchill that was vandalised, was graffitied.
But I mean, who would be doing the vandalising there? You said they've had Black Lives Matter protests in the Czech Republic. Would that have been them?
They've happened in hundreds of cities around the world. And, you know, that's here. It was quite a small protest. That's taken within the context of every week over here. You have tens of thousands of protesters coming out against the government at the moment. So there's quite a healthy protest culture. But be under no illusion, if what we were seeing in London was repeated over here in the Czech Republic, the police would move in, do their job, and prosecute people who are violent and people who are destroying our statues.
Yes, yeah. Is this something, you have quite a few connections with Poland, don't you, Rafe? I mean, what is the situation like in Poland? Is this sort of thing even having any purchase at all there?
No, not at all, for the very simple reason that the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe have lived through a time when institutions were taken over, when their symbols and history were expunged and purged. And the first thing that they did when communism collapsed and fell was to restore their national flags, restore their coats of arms, restore their national honours system, bring back their prized sacred relics and statues, and celebrate their past and their history. So it's actually from a point of privilege in the West that people are talking about, they have the luxury to talk about their oppression, whereas they have no concept of what oppression is really like. And I happen to have been behind the Iron Curtain during the communist times, and I've seen oppression there, you know. I mean, if people are going to be oppressed, my great-grandmother was sent to Siberia, my grandfather's brother was murdered by the Russians in the Katyn massacre. Those people have been oppressed, and they've seen how that oppressive regime tried very much to expunge the existing culture and supplant it with a new foreign ideology. And there are parallels that can be drawn in terms of the way that ideological movement tried to get rid of all of the historical bonds that tied the people to their national story. And so there's a complete revulsion against that idea happening in civilized societies of Central Europe, and it's something which we here should be alive and alert to too, because although there are no sinister KGB forces in this country, the effect is the same, to try to erase those vital connections that tie people to its sense of identity and purpose and to a sense of national confidence.
I mean, that is what's really happening, isn't it, Emma? The sort of sense in which people are being, the ties which bind, as we would call it, are sort of being cut, aren't they? I mean, this seems to be on purpose.
It's interesting, actually, to see, like you mentioned, the ridiculous statue that's gone up in Trafalgar Square and some of the other statues that have been proposed, that all of them are ahistorical.
Yes.
They are, you know, round circular blobs to talk about, you know, the unspoken history of various countries, and it does seem to be like it's almost a symbol of this, the endless present that we spoke about in the last episode when we discussed this, and the ground zero, the sort of totalitarian streak that I think a lot of the people I've spoken to, friends who are from Poland or their ancestors or themselves who had experience of living under totalitarianism, this is something that for them resonates deeply because they know it when they see it. But I think for us, we lack that kind of context, and it's interesting as well to look at the political divide between those who are supporting it. So recently, the protest outside of the Museum of the Home in London, where they had the Socialist Worker placards, and some recent Pew statistics as well showed it.
This is the Pew Institute, isn't it?
Yeah, so they reviewed the social media activity throughout the BLM protests after the death of George Floyd. They reviewed sort of the politicians' activity on social media within the Anglosphere and found that, firstly, the UK was far more active than any of the other countries in the Anglosphere. And across the Anglosphere, there was a clear divide between those who were tweeting, criticising the protests or criticising the destruction of heritage, and those who were in support of the protests, being a very sort of clear left-right divide. So in some ways it's a bit chicken or egg, you know, are they supporting it because they're left-wing, or is there some other reason, some other motive for why they think that, you know, the erasure of history is a good thing, and why they would like to see it replaced with these sorts of timeless idiotic blobs, yes, like the one in Trafalgar Square.
I've noticed also, for example, that sort of what you might call harmless statues are going up. You mentioned blobs, but there's actually rather a lovely one of Gene Kelly singing in the rain. It's gone up in Leicester Square, and it's a lovely statue. But I mean, it's sort of not going to do any harm to anyone, is it? It's not going to sort of say anything. Thomas, I want to talk to you. You obviously, you're, decades younger than I am. And I wondered, what do statues mean to you exactly? Why did you get involved in your particular case?
Well, I think that statues aren't just there to glorify people; they're there to remind us that they existed, so they participated in making our nation what it is today, basically.
And so, what happened? What did you actually do? It was It was the Baden-Powell statue, wasn't it? Can you just tell us what happened? How did you get involved in that? What did you do?
So I heard on the news that the local council were planning to take down the statue of Robert Baden-Powell, who founded the Scout movement in over a century ago. And because I'm not a Scout myself, but I do support the Scouting movement, I made a petition to keep it where it was. So I shared that on community groups, on Facebook, on Twitter, and it took off from there, basically.
And so how many signatures did you get in the end?
I think it was 40,000, over 40,000 signatures in the end.
Right. But I mean, therefore, so do you think that actually really did help change the council's mind about this?
In the end, they decided that it would be boarded up, and then earlier last month they took away the boarding and it's now on display again.
Right, I see. Robert, you've been doing a lot of petitions, haven't you? Organising petitions, and do you think they are effective? I mean, this appears to be a case where they've been very effective.
Well, we've certainly seen them being used effectively on the other side. Yes. They've been using them in order to prompt council debates. Yeah. And to publicise their efforts to get rid of the statues. They've really taken off online. On our side, it's been a lot harder, really, to get traction, to get numbers, with the one exception, perhaps, of the Baden-Powell that you've mentioned. Yeah. But they still do have some effect, I'm sure. We've had some success, for instance, in Peterborough recently. We chose to highlight that campaign where they had a vote in their council to review all their statues and street names, but we wanted to take a more kind of proactive approach to this and actually get in before there and petition the councillors specifically on that point to try and at least give them some confidence that there are a lot of people out there, the majority in fact, who really don't agree with this attack on our history and heritage and don't want these reviews to take place. There's no large groundswell of public opinion asking for these, and at the moment, as we said before, councils should really have a lot more better things to do with their time and resources. So, I mean, we think that petition maybe had an impact on some of the councillors. The motion was withdrawn in the end for lack of support. But
can I ask, who are the sort of people who put the petitions in to bring statues down? I mean, who are they? Are they just like any old body? Who are they? Who are the people who sort of start these things to remove somebody?
I think they are generally anybody. A lot of them have been triggered from there's a website that highlights the statues that are supposedly racist, and these can be submitted by anyone, and the petition started by anyone. They can also be signed by anyone. There's no real due diligence or requirements for where you live, for example. They can be signed from anywhere in the world. It could just be the same people signing the same petitions over and over again. We've seen cases as well where the numbers are massaged a bit, where petitions, maybe 2 petitions for the same cause, and then it's reported, they add the numbers together and say so many people signed a petition, which clearly isn't true because it's probably the same people signing both, just being double counted.
Richard, what's your faith in? Petitions seem to be a good thing, but I mean, at the same time, we've got to arm ourselves. I know you've been talking about this a lot with the campaign. We've got to kind of arm ourselves with as much legal knowledge as possible, haven't we?
Yes, I mean, just to pick up on Rob's point, the fact is that these petitions are being set up by a lot of former members of the Socialist Workers Party, people that have frankly not been successful even in local politics, but we all seem to be dancing to their tune. So they do have an amplified effect. And in terms of sort of Rob's work and our work, it's become almost a war of attrition around petitions, because if you're not in that space, it looks like that they are speaking on behalf of the majority. But what we've got to do really is form a big membership base, connect all the people that are concerned about their local history and public realm, set up local branches, start running for councils, start launching local petitions, start building new statues, and take the offensive back, really. You know, because all the time at the moment, our space for the sort of the law-abiding majority is just being overwhelmed by a few hard left online activists. You know, it's frankly absurd that we find ourselves in this situation where we have to defend our stated history and our stated views.
Do you think
Some people might be saying, well, why are you chaps focusing on statues? Surely there are much bigger and important issues to deal with today. But anybody who thinks that this is going to end with statues is deluded.
Absolutely.
This is merely the most visible. And if there's a victory for the other side on the issue of statues, then they'll be encouraged and emboldened beyond belief. So this is really the first front in a long battle, or the most visible front in a long battle, because one has to actually question the motives of those people who are putting out these petitions. Because, come on, be honest, nobody is oppressed by a statue commemorating somebody from 200 years ago. The idea is absurd, you know. If people in Eastern Europe can walk around and see statues of Lenin and others without being oppressed when those atrocities happened to themselves or their parents or grandparents, nobody in this country is oppressed by a statue commemorating somebody who lived 200 years ago. That's 8 generations, your great. And forgive me, but the attempt to equate the black experience in this country with the black experience in America is absurd. There was a famous adage in the 1700s in a law case, you know, as soon as a slave sets foot upon English soil, he's a free man. There's been no traditional slavery here. All the blacks living in this country arrived here of free choice. And that has to be emphasized. And so you have to ask, what is the motive then if no one's really being oppressed? And it's a direct assault on British culture, British identity, and the very essence of the British spirit. Because you have to think, who are the people who are being attacked? It's Drake. It's Nelson, it's Churchill, our greatest symbols of Britishness, the very people who epitomise the British spirit, mavericks, independent, outward-looking, adventurous, swashbuckling buccaneer types. That's Britishness, and that's anathema to everything that these people stand for. That's why this campaign is so important, and that's why people need to support it.
I think beautifully put, Rafe, actually. I mean, you know, Emma, would you say that are they the Marxists they claim to be? I mean, frankly, looking at them, it seems to me that they are at the very, very best scratch Marxists. I mean, it's very unsophisticated. Or is it just nihilism? I mean, is it the same thing that we are seeing in Europe with the destruction of churches, which we have not quite seen here on the same, but I know you have certainly notified and brought attention to. It's extraordinary what's happening in France, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't think necessarily you have to even separate out the different strands of this. You know, it's a bit of nihilism, it's a bit of Marxism, it's just there's a whole zeitgeist behind this that has been building for decades now. And I think everything that Rafe has said is completely true. I think that what's happened with the statues is that it was basically, it whetted their appetite. And now what we're seeing is there have been lots of instances where it's like the sins of the father are being visited on the sons, but now it's becoming increasingly, you know, far removed. So there was a thing recently about Rhodes's uncle and a school changing, I think it was their name because it was associated with Rhodes's uncle in some way, even though Rhodes's uncle had died when Rhodes was 3 or something like that. And so it was increasingly far removed, and even in we've seen it with the National Trust in Scotland, in Liverpool with the appointment of particular people to kind of be like the witchfinder general, looking to try and find increasingly abstract sins wherever they can find them. And it's exactly what Rafe is describing, that it's not it's like we're talking about Marxism, you know, it's not that regimented. It's a sort of visceral attack on something very core and central to the country. And I think that's why it at least resonates with what's been happening with growing anti-Christian sentiment and attacks on churches in France, because I think it's that same sort of visceral sense of things that are associated with anything Western being assaulted in some way. And there are plenty of people who have spoken out about this who are people of colour who have been attacked and called horrific racist terms, and it's because the people who are attacking them seem to be sort of identifying something in them that they think is, you know, Western, and also somehow participating in this. I think one activist was recently, they had been accused of having temporary white privilege. Temporary white privilege. And so I think it's you don't have to necessarily separate out the different strands of this. It's a kind of long-term zeitgeist that wants to break everything down. So that's where the nihilism comes in, but it also has this kind of ideological motivation behind it. And I think it's actually probably early doors for even trying to unpick it. But you know, we've seen with the Tate Britain as well, with the, you know, the mural in their restaurant area that they wanted to have removed. And it's like Rafe said,
it's a very famous one by Rex Whistler.
Yeah, and it's not. It's, you know, that it's the same with the National Trust in Scotland. Yeah. They identified, I think it was a fifth of their properties were in some way involved in slavery or colonialisation. And when you look at the list, it is increasingly abstract, and you think, well, you know, if there are pieces of art in a collection that were funded with the profits from plantations in Jamaica. Or indirectly, in some instances, one of the monuments to the Jacobites who fell in the rebellion is on land that was owned by someone who, at some point, his family profited from slavery. You know, and so you have to ask, well, what's the material consequence of this? Do you hide away the art collections? Do you burn them? What happens to them? Because I think once you concede an inch on it, then it's always going to be asking, well, what next, what next, what next? Until everything in the public space, or even in these cases, things that are held in trust or on private properties, will just be round, spherical, inoffensive blobs.
I tend to agree with you. I think that, you know, when it comes to things like plaques, you know, which explain the pros and cons, I think, to me, that is more than just the thin end of the wedge. I think you're giving way too much. You know, it's apologising in a way, I think. Thomas, I mean, does what we're saying resonate with you at all? I mean, you know, look, you're nearer, you know, you're nearer to having been at school than maybe we are here, right? But did you, for example, get a sense that British history was, you were made to feel ashamed of it in some way growing up, would you say?
Yeah, in instances, I think that we were made to feel ashamed of British history and how it came to be. But I think that
for example, you know, there is this sort of sense of you only ever hear about the bad things in British history, and you know, and the good things about good dates in British history are no longer really celebrated. Is that something you recognise? Was that your experience?
Yeah, in a way, it's. I mean, there were good parts, and then I think I was made to think about more of the bad parts and the good parts, really. That the whole imperial empire thing was bad because you had the slave trade. And, yeah.
Yes. Richard, this is entirely absent, isn't it, in, say, like places like the Czech Republic? I mean, the idea of kind of cultural self-loathing?
Almost entirely. I think what there is over here is a healthy, reflective education system that teaches critiquing, it teaches deeper understanding of social, political and economic issues. I mean, I've worked in higher education in the UK for the best part of a decade now, and one has to say that it's dumbed down, and the way that politics and sociology is taught is delivered in an infantile and one-dimensional way. And so therefore it's not surprising that the younger generation wants to knock down monuments of things that they simply don't understand, have never been asked to understand. And just sort of picking up on Emma's point, she's absolutely right. But if you look at the history of slavery, it actually contributed so little to the British economy in the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. We're looking at something like, at the best case scenario, a plus 3% addition to the revenue of the country. It was a major economic inhibitor to industrialization and the rest of it. Now, it benefited just a few families. But you know, we all know that we would dislike those individuals today, but we would not destroy the statues and the things that sort of reflect how history evolved at that point. You know, if you don't like sugar plantations and the history of it, well, should we all ban beer, for example? I mean, this is just going to absurd territory.
Of course, it's obvious that slavery is as old as prostitution and taxes, really. I mean, it goes back thousands of years. Britain was involved in it for a very short period of time. Britain led the whole world against slavery. I've always thought this new thing, Emancipation Day, should actually be a day to celebrate British achievements. And that Emancipation Day, we just had it, is the day that the British Empire abolished slavery, and it's now becoming more popular. But I think it actually should be a way to actually educate people about the fact that it was Britain and the Empire that led the world, including having the Royal Navy enforce the abolition of the slave trade on the Atlantic Oceans. And people need to be educated about the fact that, you know, slavery continued long after in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world. You know, there were approximately 12 to 15 slaves who were transported from Africa to the Americas. An equal number were actually held in slavery by other Africans. People don't realize that. You know, when European and American ships were moored off the coast of Africa and never actually made incursions into the country, they were actually purchasing slaves from other Africans who had enslaved other warring tribes. No one seems to talk about that at all. And of course, all these millions of words and all these people marching on the streets against the oppressive British Empire and its slavery seem curiously silent about the fact that there are 40 million people living in slavery today in the world. That's, I think, 7 in every 1,000 Africans today are living in bonded labour and slavery. And yet, where are the great protests around the African embassies and high commissions about that? There's an eerie silence, and I think that silence is a very loud thing in itself.
Certainly when I hear about decolonising the curriculum, it always makes me feel slightly surprised, because I mean, I remember personally not being taught anything in particularly wonderful about the empire. It was always really the other way round, or just skipped over to a large degree. But really, I think, yeah, this battle for history as well is certainly beyond schools and education. It's moving into other areas. It's certainly in the museums. It's in the plaques that you talked about, where people are saying that this will be kind of to provide a balanced history, but of course it doesn't really look like it's going to be anything of the sort. It's going to be a totally one-sided view of history the other way. And we see it as well spreading into other areas, I think, online in particular, with something I've noticed on Wikipedia. There was an example when the statue of Baron Holland in Holland Park was vandalised, and I looked, and within maybe 2 hours his entry on Wikipedia had been updated with a paragraph all about this graffiti attack, possibly even by the person who did it. We don't know. Anyone could edit Wikipedia, basically. It's a crowdsourced kind of history, but it's very commonly used now. For some people it's really their only history. Sometimes it's okay, as a starting point that you can then back up with further reading and the like, but for many that's it, and it's becoming a new battleground as well, to edit those entries and actually control how people see our history.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting, because this thing about decolonising the curriculum, I saw a piece in the Evening Standard last night. It was just a small report. There's a school in London, I can't remember the name, but I wouldn't say it anyway. They've just won an award, an inclusivity award, for they have decolonised their curriculum, right? But the point is, it's not, I took that to mean quite literally sort of anti-imperial history or whatever. It's not actually. It's basically getting rid of what you might call the canon of Western culture. So out go white authors, in come black authors. I think they're no longer even going to teach the 7 wonders of the world, for example. This is presumably because it's too much of a white idea. I don't know. But this is the point, Emma, isn't it? Decolonisation is not quite how it sounds, is it?
I think actually this goes to the heart of the matter, and I think, I mean, both of you raised a really important point, which is it's a question of which stories we're choosing to teach, the perspective that we're choosing to look at these aspects of history through, because there are many stories you can teach. The story of the white working class is something that and their role in the Industrial Revolution is something that doesn't really get very much attention within the curriculum. But when we talk about decolonising the curriculum, what it usually seems to boil down to is, again, it's the sort of social justice theory categories, the LGBTQ, gender, orientation, and however long the list is now. It's less to do with the British Empire and more to do with breaking down the traditional categories of education, the traditional categories through which we view history, and trying to find things that are problematic within that. And I think it's interesting because it's a question of which stories we're choosing to teach. Because if you look at, again, going back to the National Trust in Scotland, I think it's great if you want to tell those stories about the connections between particular houses and the transatlantic slave trade, or the role of the people who were living in that house at the time within Jamaica. One of the houses, I think, was modelled on a house that was in the plantation somewhere. Yeah. That's fine to teach that history. I think it's a great thing. Teach as much history as you possibly can. But I think we have to be asking ourselves, why is it this history that the focus seems to be on? And it seems to be a kind of almost a cultural point now, a cultural default, that all institutions everywhere are really, this is trendy now. And whilst focusing on this, we should be asking ourselves, well, if we're actually going to employ some critical thinking, what other stories are we missing here? Because, as Richard mentioned about the contribution of slavery to the economy, what was the economy like at the time? Where are we actually discussing, because often you hear talk about, the white working class during this period of time and the role of industrialization and oppressing them, and how do all these things link together? We don't have room to discuss that, and I think we need to ask ourselves why these stories, and why is it the socialist worker is so keen on it?
And of course, it's the Institute of Education, it's the teaching colleges that I've often said are the black heart of this postmodernist attempt to deconstruct Britain and the very nature of Britishness. And so you have to ask, what is a civilization? Civilizations come and go, and what is their legacy? It's their monuments, it's their philosophy, it's their literature and their writings. And any civilization and culture that isn't brave enough to stand up and defend those doesn't deserve to exist. And yet what we're seeing here is that a complete erosion of our own sense of self-confidence and a complete failure to teach the young, who will grow up without knowing any of this. And so it's a sort of atrophying civilization that you have as a result of that. And that's their goal. You can win a war and a revolution without flying red flags from the rooftop, simply by undermining from within. And that's what we're seeing now.
Do you think that, actually, from what you've been doing, Robert, online with Save Our Statues Online, do you think people kind of get that? Do you think they know it's that? Or, have you been struck by, presumably you've been struck by people's passion about this, because one's always worried that people are going to be apathetic. That's not what we found with this new websiting campaign. But have you been struck by people's, the sheer their emotion about this subject?
Yes, definitely. And I think as well, like you say, they do know it, or they are largely aware of, to an extent, what you've just been talking about, and the wider cultural war that's really behind it. I think very much so. Yes,
That's very important, though, if they are.
Yeah. But whether they are representative of the wider population, I don't know. I think the followers we have on Twitter are probably on the active edge, I suppose, and perhaps more in tune with, some of the other discussions on social media. So they're more alert to seeing the underlying factors, I think, driving it.
Yeah. I mean, Richard, there's been a very good response to the new campaign, hasn't there?
It's been terrific, and not surprising for me. We've had pretty much an even split. If we want to go into identity politics, we've had an even split between male and female. We've had people generally around the country feeding into us and subscribing. What's noticeable is the low amount of interest from within the City of London and sort of the inner boroughs of London. We've had messages of support from America that say their history, their revolution is almost gone, but can they help us? And really, it's been a lot of young people as well. It's been very, very inspiring. What's noticeable about this is that people are viscerally upset and emotionally damaged. I have to say, on a personal level, I've never been through anything like this. Where your culture and your history is just being erased before your eyes, and there seems to be nothing you can do. And this campaign is about bringing people together to reject that narrative. We are the moral majority. We are the law-abiding communities, and we are going to win this one. And if that means standing for council next year or in 2 years' time or running for parliament, we will do it, and we will do it together.
You mentioned there about London, Richard, relatively little coming from London. That doesn't surprise me at all. And I mentioned at the beginning of the programme about Sadiq Khan's particular review, which is called the Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm, which is actually wrong even grammatically. A realm is a country, I believe, and you can't be just in a city. Anyway, be that as it may, this is going to revise, as it were, looking all the way through all of London's monuments. And there's a particular significance here, isn't it? Because the monuments in London as well are national, actually internationally important, aren't they, Rafe?
They're national monuments, they're international monuments. Many of them were funded by privates and donations, by public subscription. There are different parts of London that are governed by different rules and laws. Different areas, Westminster Council or local councils, or if it's a crown roads. There are a whole bunch of different policies. So how on earth you would have an overriding policy on this, I can't see whatsoever. And of course, a lot of it is the fact that, of course, London is the capital of the whole country. Lots of things are put in there because it's a national capital rather than just a fiefdom of the Labour Party or of Sadiq Khan. And so I'm not sure in what his plans to do. And then, of course, if you're going to start this precedent, then who's to say that in 25 years from now, people won't be removing the statues erected in the last 5 years? And it's a very dangerous road to go down. I'd much rather see Sadiq Khan speak out about modern slavery in Pakistan. This is a man who's constantly telling us all that he's the son of a Pakistani bus driver. Not once have I ever heard him condemn the fact that slavery in Pakistan is the worst in the entire planet. And he even went there on an official visit. And not once did he raise the issue of slavery in Pakistan. And yet he's one of the key people calling for a slavery museum in this country and calling for Britain to wear sackcloth and for its role in the slave trade, and yet he's completely silent about it when it's happening today. And I would have thought that the lives of people today are a lot more important.
Yes. I think the interesting thing about London as well is that the mayor has sort of strange, quite vague areas of power, but he has particular authority over things like Trafalgar Square. Hence I started by talking about this big ice cream that's gone up, or Parliament Square. It's not just a council thing, it's a complicated situation in London, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, well, certainly like you say, in London in particular, these are national monuments, but I would even stretch that to those around the country. Who's to say who really has a stake in these? It's not just even the local people. And certainly I think people are surprised that the councils have so much power. It's not really what they were elected to do. They're elected to run a city or a town, but not really to take these kinds of decisions. And as well, it's quite clear that the councils don't want to ask the people sometimes. You know, if you were to put these questions to a public vote, whether that's locally or nationally, I think it's quite clear the way it would go. From every time people are asked, they generally say they want to keep them. So it seems to be an unusual situation where the councils or other institutions as well that have a stakeholder in this have this power.
Well, look, I mean, I think that we really should draw real encouragement and comfort from the response to this campaign, into what you've done, Rob, on Twitter, and indeed generally to the extent of feeling that you get from people around the country. And I just think we've got to sort of make sure that we are equipped with the right knowledge, to actually oppose what's going on. I think that's what it's about. To that end, please do, won't you, subscribe or join saveourstatues.org.uk. You can become a member too, and indeed if you get involved and you can tell us about your local situation, and indeed we can help you as much as we possibly can and build a real network. In the meantime, thank you to Rafe, to Emma, to Richard, to Thomas and to Robert. And we will be giving you updates on the campaign as it goes along over the coming months. So do join. See you soon. Thank you. Bye.